Hello, everybody. I don't know if you can see my dog over here just spazzing out. Say, hey, Mimi. Okay. Hey, there they are. Welcome, everybody. I'll give everybody a couple minutes to filter in here. We've got a spaz over here. Can't bear that nobody's paying attention to her for like 5 minutes. Mimi. Okay, yeah, good girl. All right. One more minute. People trickling in late. Hey, buddy. Name's Doug. Yes. Can I help you? That's very rude. Okay. We're supposed to have about 20-ish today. Oh, calm down. Okay, so plan for today. Got another one. Our tentative plan for today, we're going to dip our toes in the water in chapter 5, but most of the focus is going to be on your test, which is this weekend. Yeah, so you have the test itself, which I'll talk about like how to get to and what that will entail. And then you also have your learning curves, which I will go ahead and show you how to get to now. Hopefully you've done at least a little bit of those, but learning curves, if you go to, hold on, I'm gonna share my screen. Skipped a step. Well, share screen, are we here? Beautiful, okay. So if you go to our course page, here we are. At our announcements page, if you go down to assignments, click on this learning curve folder. Here they are on all their glory. So you have, I think, 4 for chapter 1, all of these, and then 4 for chapter 2 as well. So what I would do is I would do some of these, all of these, a few of these before you take the test, because I think that would prepare you really well. You'll also have the Kahoot today, Kahoot we did last week. That should get you in pretty good shape. But I will tell you that those learning curves are kind of annoying, but a lot of people either like dropped letter grades or even didn't pass the class last semester because they didn't do the learning curves. Just do them, just get them out of the way. They're a good study tool, and like they will help you learn the material better. So they're there to kind of help pad your grade a little bit too. Okay, so you got that. To take the test, you will need to go right back to our Blackboard page, go to tests, see that all these are not available yet, but once it is available, you hit test 1. HonorLock is not engaged for this one because I forgot to engage it for the other classes, so I'm not going to make you guys do HonorLock for this one. They will be on the next one though, so I would ask you to still maintain honor system there and not open any other URLs while you are taking the test. But obviously I can't manually stop you. Hey, I'm being very needy. All right, so all that in mind, if you have any questions about the test, please email me. That is due Sunday night at midnight. I think I program it so that you guys have like an hour and a half to take the test. It probably won't take that long. It's usually about 60 questions long. All of the questions will be different from test to test. So like it'll be in different orders. There will be a few different questions that get sprinkled in, just depending on how the computer mixes it up for you. That is to try and cut down on the ability to like share answers, but it's still all going to be material that we have covered in class. So it's not going to be just like brand new stuff that I'm throwing at you. And then next week we will go over a few of the questions that people got wrong, try to get back on the same page. But yeah, if you have any questions about the test, feel free to email me. But that being said, we are going to hop into chapter 5, which is about learning. So we're going to learn about learning. This will not take super long because again, I want us to have plenty of time to take our Kahoot because this is our last chance to review material from chapters 1 and 2, which will be the only chapters on the test. So there won't be any chapter 5 stuff on the test, but this is just to kind of get you guys started, headed in that direction. Okay, so learning. Some of this is stuff that we have already learned. Learned, but just fleshed out more. So we've talked a little bit about operant and classical conditioning, but we will be getting into those more heavily. Hey, dog. Speaking of dogs, one of the case studies that they use in the book is about Cesar Millan, who I don't know if you guys are old enough to have seen much of The Dog Whisperer, but this is the guy. Cesar Millan is from Mexico, trains dogs, had a show called The Dog Whisperer. He went into people's houses that had badly behaving dogs and taught them to not behave so badly. Now, he uses a pretty strictly behavioral approach, and there are ups and downs to teaching dogs, mostly downs, teaching dogs through that behaviorism approach, and also with teaching humans that way. But we will talk about that later on. Okay, so what is learning? Okay, so learning, as is defined in the book, is, hold on, I had a question. Okay, so somebody asked, are the learning curves due on a certain day? Yes, the learning curves will be due. I know that I have not mentioned them super a lot, so I probably won't have them due because normally they're due on the same Sunday night as the test, but our schedule has been like totally thrown off. We're getting that late start, so I will say they will be due on Sunday night. Would be what, the 20th? So we'll say 27th. So that will be the 27th of February. We'll say that is when those are due. They'll probably say something different in the book, but I can go back and change that. Okay. All right. Okay, back into learning. So learning is a relatively enduring change in behavior that results from experiences. Okay, so we're talking about if you actually like internalized a behavior, it's something that sticks with you. So you think about that old axiom that if you it's just like riding a bike. So if you learn how to ride a bike, you don't really have to relearn how to ride a bike. You just kind of do it. You go back, it's muscle memory. So it can begin before we're born. So we actually learn like the sound of our mom's voice while we're in her tummy, and it occurs all the time. And we learn literally until the day we die. So part of learning is this idea of habituation. It's a basic form of learning. That involves an organism not responding as strongly or as often to an event following multiple exposures to it. So for example, my dog, who's running around like a crazy person right now. Maybe come here. Hey, come on. Shut up. So when we got her initially, we had a garage at her old house, and she was very, very scared of the garage door. And so every time it opened, she was a rescue. So every time the garage door opened, she like freaked out a little bit. But through this process of habituation, she heard the garage door more times, and slowly but surely, she got less afraid of it as it, opened. So we would call that sound of the garage door opening stimulus. It's an event or object that leads to a change in behavior. A stimulus, in a more general sense, is just something that happens that your senses pick up. So you've probably heard that, like maybe in an exercise sense, like exercise stimulus, like trying to get you to a certain point. But yeah, we're going to talk a lot about classical conditioning and how different stimuli can create different reactions. Mimi, come here. Come here. Come. Up, up. No, that's not up. Come here. Hey, come on. All right, so talking about behaviorism, badly behaved dog. Okay. So there are more than 3 types of learning, but these are the 3 main types of learning that we're going to talk about. So we have classical conditioning, which we've discussed in chapter 1. It's an association between 2 different stimuli. It's a very basic association. Operant conditioning, which is connecting those stimuli to the behavior and the consequences that will come from that behavior. And then observational learning, which is watching and imitating others and sort of how we pick up behaviors and pick up beliefs and things like that from models in our life, not just you think about like parental figures, but also people that we admire. May, hey, it's okay. What's going on? Oh, there's people out walking. That's why. All right. So classical conditioning. This guy called Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist. He was actually not a psychologist. He was a physiologist studying digestion. So he was trying to figure out how dogs digested food and like what different stimuli could affect that. And so he sort of stumbled into this discovery when he found out that the dogs would not just salivate at the smell of food, because they would do that. You sort of do that biologically without really having to think about it. But he also realized that the dogs had associated sounds like ringing a bell or, like the footsteps of the person that usually came and fed them, the sight of one of the researchers, things like that with the food. And so over time, the dogs had sort of cut out the middleman. Instead of actually having to smell the food, they would just hear the sound or see the researcher and start to drool. So yeah, it says here, dogs salivated to the sight or sound of the lab assistant instructed to feed them. Pavlov conditioned the dogs to salivate in response to flashing lights and various sounds. So Pavlov took that idea and ran with it. And he said, well, how can I stretch this out and see how many different stimuli I can associate this with? And all of this is associated with an idea called classical conditioning. The classical conditioning learning process in which 2 stimuli become associated with each other. Originally, neutral stimulus is conditioned to elicit an involuntary response. Okay. So an example of this would be, so my dog, she really loves cheese, as most dogs do. So she will, if she hears the cheese drawer open in our fridge, she will come from wherever she is in the house and try and get some of that because my girl loves cheese. So she has associated that sound with getting food. So she has initially that sound of that drawer wouldn't mean anything to her. So it would be a neutral stimulus. It doesn't cause that automatic or reflexive response. It doesn't mean anything to her initially. But through this initial phase of acquisition, so acquisition is at the beginning of learning something, how you begin to associate 2 ideas. Through acquisition, she has learned to make that connection, and she's learned it really well. All right, so there are a few pieces to this puzzle. So we talked about the neutral stimulus. That is probably the first one, because the example I use here is a metronome. So when Pavlov was trying to get these dogs to do what he wanted them to do, he would do things like ring a bell or use a buzzer or a metronome, which is a timekeeping device. And initially that didn't mean anything to the dogs. So that is not something that is indigenous to a dog's normal environment. It's not something that they would have any biological response to independently of an experimental setting. So we would call that a neutral stimulus. But when they smelled the food, they had what is called an unconditioned response. So this happens with us too. The unconditioned stimulus would be like the smell of food, sight of food, because it automatically triggers an involuntary response without any learning needed. Nobody has to teach you to get hungry if you smell something delicious. Okay, your body just does that naturally. It's a biological response. And that response itself is the unconditioned response. So it's reflexive, it's involuntary. So in Pavlov's case, the unconditioned stimulus would be like the smell of the food. I actually used a meat powder, which sounds kind of gross, but the dogs could still smell it because dogs have a really spectacular sense of smell. And then the unconditioned response was their little tummies started rumbling because dogs like to eat. Okay, so after a while, that unconditioned stimulus, or I should say the neutral stimulus. So the neutral stimulus is the thing that doesn't mean anything to the subject outside of that experimental setting until they make that association. So that neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. So if, in Pavlov's case, they rang the bell enough times as the dogs were being fed, that bell, which didn't mean anything initially to the dogs, now does. So now the bell, they sort of cut out the middleman. And so there's no food necessary to create that conditioned response, which is their stomach growling and getting hungry. So the conditioned stimulus is the evolution of the neutral stimulus. So that the bell has now changed from just being a sound that they hear to a sound that they associate with the idea of being fed, and that will create that conditioned response. Okay, so example here is McDonald's. This is a lot. We're going to talk about advertising theory a good bit here because this is a lot of what advertising theory sort of relies on. So before conditioning, if you just see the McDonald's logo, it doesn't mean anything to you. You have no response to it. So let's say you're from another country that doesn't have McDonald's. I don't know which other country doesn't have McDonald's because they're pretty much everywhere. Like I went to China and there were McDonald's there. Yeah, initially that logo doesn't mean anything. But if you smell their fries, because their fries are delicious, you might have a tummy rumble and you might salivate. If you've ever smelled something delicious, makes you drool, just like a dog. But over time, if you go to McDonald's enough, let's say your job's on Woodruff and you're driving past 2 or 3 McDonald's on the way to work, and sometimes in a moment of weakness, you decide that you want a nice double quarter pounder. Mamie, come here. Come on. Good girl. Good dog. Yeah, so over time, if you do that enough, you will link the sight of that logo with the food itself, and you have created a mental association to the point that after that conditioning period, after that acquisition, you will go straight to seeing the McDonald's logo and just having that all automatic biological response. And that's kind of what advertisers are counting on. So, you see this a lot with like spokespeople. So you may not be initially obliged to eat Subway a whole lot, but you may like Steph Curry, and Steph Curry is a spokesperson for Subway. And so you may say, oh, well, I like Steph Curry, and so I feel this emotional connection to whatever he is involved with. So I may be more likely to associate him with that brand and then buy whatever that brand is selling me. Okay, so we'll do a few more of these. I have my watch on, so I gotta check what time it is. Okay, yeah, we're good. Hey, buddy. All right, stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization is tendency for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit the conditioned response. Okay, so May, she, like I said earlier, will come from wherever corner of the house she is in if she hears the cheese drawer open. But the fruit drawer and even the cabinets next to our fridge kind of sound like the cheese drawer. So she has learned to generalize that stimulus to other things. Okay, so she will still run to the kitchen if she hears us open another drawer in the fridge or a cabinet, because she thinks she might get food because it kind of sounds like that other thing. So Pavlov's dogs, we talked about their use of the metronome. So metronomes can go in different speeds. They're timekeeping devices, using a lot of music. So what they found was that the dogs would generalize that stimulus to a certain range. So if they played the metronome at 80 BPM, that the dogs would still salivate even if they bumped it up to like 100. But if they went past that, this idea called stimulus discrimination, if I turn the microwave on, like the dog is not going to come and expect food, because that stimulus doesn't sound like anything like the cheese drawer opening. So she has learned to discriminate certain sounds Pavlov's dogs were also the same way. So if the metronome went past that range, or if they played certain tones relative to other tones, it says here, they would salivate to a high-pitched tone, not a low-pitched tone, because they discriminated that low-pitched tone. Hey, buddy. She's very needy today. I don't know why. Hey. Okay, extinction. Okay, so this is not just talking about like the dinosaurs. Extinction in this case, if you don't, continue to make associations over time, they can go away. So we talked about the McDonald's example. So let's say you change jobs, and so now the nearest McDonald's is 10 minutes away instead of 5. It's no longer nearly as convenient, and you don't go for a while. You don't get nearly as many Big Macs. So if that period lasts, 6 to 8 months, eventually you might not, if you drive past the McDonald's, immediately feel that conditioned response. So we would call that extinction. So if we just didn't have a tree store for a while, may not, make that connection immediately. But let's say if you are, you go back past a McDonald's after that same period, you can spontaneously recover that association. So the reappearance of a conditioned response following its extinction. So we talked about like how you never really forget how to ride a bike. There's the research here suggests that the conditioned response is suppressed, not forgotten. So it didn't just go away. It was just sort of lessened after a while. You can also, so this is kind of an extension of stimulus generalization. And so they also found that they could pair multiple stimuli and sort of like cut out the middleman of the middleman. So in this case, you can see that conditioning, they pair the buzzer with food and then just the buzzer. And then higher order conditioning, they actually pair the buzzer with something else. So in this case, a light bulb. So like they would turn on a light and the dogs would still salivate. And then eventually they would get to the point where they didn't even need the buzzer. They could just use the light. So higher order conditioning is adding sort of an extra layer of stimuli. A second neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus also. All right, so a quick little bit on this dog. So his name is Gavin. We're talking about dogs a lot in this chapter because they're just good behavioral studies, because they're good little animals. They want to be our friends and want to do what we want most of the time. Gavin. Okay, so Gavin, ATF dog. Gavin, I think he was in Afghanistan, is what the book says. So he had a fear of everyday noises because of these principles of classical conditioning. So why was the dog afraid of everyday noises? Well, the dog was in a war zone for like multiple years, hearing very scary noises, explosions, gunshots, all that kind of stuff pretty regularly. So when Gavin got back to the States, he was afraid of normal household sounds like, the microwave, the garage door, things like that. Poor dog. The dog pretty much had PTSD. And so they had to try and decondition him to not be afraid of those things so he could have a normal little doggy life. And he's an ATF dog, so he had a job to do, and his fear was prohibiting him from doing his job. So how did they do this? Well, they, instead of trying to just eliminate an association, they try to create new associations. So what they would do is they would play, the sound of a microwave going on or the sound of a garage door while the dog was on the treadmill. And so the dogs really like to walk and be on the treadmill, and they enjoy exercise a whole bunch. So the dog would ideally associate that happy feeling, get that, rush of serotonin, of dopamine while it's doing exercise. And then it would associate the microwave sound with that instead of with the fear that it experienced previously. And it worked. So the dog got back to doing his normal doggy thing and not being afraid all the time, which is just a happy story. Good job, Gavin. Okay, so we will talk about conditioned taste aversion, and then we will pivot to our Kahoot because this is a good place to stop. All right, conditioned taste aversion is a powerful form of classical conditioning that occurs when an organism learns to associate the taste of a particular food or drink with illness. Okay, so from an evolutionary perspective, how might this type of learning be helpful? Well, we're going to talk about it. So, not Garcia's rats. Yeah, we're going to talk about the goannas. Okay. So this, if you see this big lizard thing that this lady is holding, presumably in Australia, that is a goanna, not to be confused with an iguana, similar but different. So big invasive species of these cane toads. You can see this little guy on the right. And the goannas were eating the cane toads because that's what they do. And there were a whole bunch of the cane toads because they didn't have any natural predators because cane toads are poisonous. And so to the goannas specifically, they would eat the cane toads and they would die. So the Australian ecosystem was losing a pretty important link, pretty important member in those goannas. And so these biologists were trying to figure out what they could do to hopefully keep the goanna population up. So what they figured out was through this idea of conditioned taste aversion, if you are, because humans and a lot of other animals and goannas as well are sort of taste first. So like the dog is smell first. So if a dog smells something bad, it's going to be a lot less likely to it's going to make that association and then not go back to that thing, or just smell something that might be dangerous to them. They like bad smells. Like she smells a lot of poop. So goannas, they would. So we're trying to make this connection in the little goanna's brain to not eat these toads. So what they did was they would feed the goannas little baby toads because the baby toads were not poisonous enough to kill them, but they would make them sick. So the idea there was that if the goannas ate baby toad, got sick, they would no longer want to eat the toads because they had made that association. They had, through that taste aversion, they had conditioned the goannas into discriminating those toads out of something that would be good for them to put in their mouths. And it worked because the goannas population actually went back up after the biologists did this enough. And they taught them, the goannas learned that this was not a healthy thing for them to eat, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so we just had at least one person just hop in here, but we are going to take a quick break because I want to have enough time for you guys to take the big chapter Kahoot. So we are going to come back, let's say like 9:18, and we will start on our Kahoot. That'll take probably like 40-45 minutes, take us to about 10-ish. And that'll be our plan. Okay, cool. All right, I will see you guys in a few minutes. Ready, break.